Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity hosted by the Maine Department of Education. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the state. Today, my presentation is the last call on Forum 2019. Every August, I travel around the state, hosting a series of forums, usually 4, in Portland, Augusta, Orono, and Presque Isle. And last year's topic was assessment in the social studies classroom. At the end of the year, then in June, I give one last call for those who were not available in August, and I'm going to offer the same opportunity here, even though it's in a virtual environment. So in this first half of the session, we're going to do 2 90-minute sessions. This one is talking about assessing inquiry and thinking. And so history and social studies in general is more than just names and dates. I think that this is kind of the stereotype that we fall into, partially because of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when Ben Stein is at the front of the room talking about the Smoot-Hartley tariff. But I think as social studies educators, we know this, and it's backed up by the research. Over 20 years of research now, dating back to the 90s. A wide variety of people, and the bottom left-hand corner, Sam Weinberg started that research in San Francisco Public Schools. And eventually what became Stanford History Education Group. Above him in the picture in the upper left is Chauncey Montesano, who actually joined us on Tuesday for a session about Read, Inquire, Write, a group that now she founded and runs at the University of Michigan. Upper middle is Jeffrey Noakes from BYU, who's done a lot of research in upper elementary school around historical thinking. Upper right is Joel Breakstone, who was a graduate student at SHEG and did his doctoral thesis work around historical assessments of thinking, or HATS, which you can now see as the Beyond the Bubble series at SHEG, Stanford History Education Group. Bottom right is Abby Reisman, who continues to do research. She's done a lot of middle school work around learning social studies. And then in the middle is Bruce Van Sledwright from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and we'll talk about some of his stuff today with weighted multiple choice. We also see it in the C3 framework with Kathy Swan, S.G. Grant, and John Lee, the 3 co-authors of the C3 framework for NCSS, and we're going to look at some of their work here in just a second. And then on the right is I always blank on his name now, Visible Thinking, John Hattie, and we're going to talk about some of the ways in which students can be assessment visible, capable visible learners, and what we're going to be looking for in that. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to send you into 5 breakout rooms, and what we're going to do as quickly as possible is that Grant, Swan, and Lee did some research following up some work in New York State about what exactly we should be doing for assessments in social studies. And I've chunked them out into these little pieces. And what I want you to do is, again, I will give you the link in the chat box in those sessions, is I want you and your partner read through these sections as quickly as we can, and then be able to just summarize what they're saying. I'm going to bring you then back into the full group, and we'll do a jigsaw. So I need to know in each of the groups who's going to be responsible for sharing the summary of what you'd read. So in your breakout room, you will be assigned one of these 5 readings. You and your partner or small group will read it, summarize it, and then we'll come back together as a full group and share those summaries. What questions do you have before we begin this activity? All right, I am going to send you into breakout rooms. Let's see. All right, welcome back, everybody. We've had our breakout rooms completed where the participants read through the different sections. So we're going to go ahead and do a jigsaw of this activity now. And the group who read The Challenge of Knowing What Students Know, if you could please unmute yourself and give us a quick little overview of what you read.
So I was a listener instead of looking at the document, so I apologize because I'll be relying on my notes. I think that what we just covered was probably an introduction to the longer article. So my takeaway, and I think my group's takeaway, is that assessments in classroom don't necessarily inspire a lot of confidence. There's a lot of problem with validity. that typically the way that we are assessing students, especially with multiple choice and even extended response questions, reinforces the idea that what we're looking for from students is to be able to come up with a laundry list of people, places, and events. Even when we're looking over time, there doesn't seem to be one best assessment that helps us understand what students know. This results in 4 particular problems. Numbers 3 and 4 were easiest for us to understand right now. One challenge is that when different evaluators look at the same material, that they walk away with different ideas and assign different scores. And then when we do have those scores, there are various interpretations of ways to use them.
Great, thank you. The group with classroom-based assessments benefits?
I think I'll do it. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Ours was short. Ours started discussing more opportunities for assessment, and more opportunities for teachers to get more robust understanding of the students' capabilities. It also discussed that close ties to the taught curriculum, so each teacher would know more about what the students are learning from what their objectives were for the curriculum. It was a better way for us to chart growth in individual students, and the varied assessments offered more learning opportunities for students. And it also discussed that standardized tests did not necessarily test, and we didn't get the results that we needed from standardized tests as we would from formative assessments in the regular classroom.
Okay, thank you. Classroom-based assessment problem number 1.
So basically, what we got out of it is that the assessment depends on the teacher, like how they're interpreting the results. And so that doesn't make it terribly reliable. And so then we kind of got into a discussion about maybe that's why social studies teachers tend to rely on true, false, multiple choice questions, because like knowing the students doesn't seem to matter. It seems like a more fair assessment of their learning rather than taking into consideration like the background of students.
Thank you. The classroom-based assessment problem number 2.
Yeah, Megan and I read over classroom-based assessment problem number 2, and it was mostly focusing on validity, whether or not the assessment represents the skill that it's meant to, and that validity is most commonly associated with high stakes testing and standardized testing, but it can be relevant in classroom assessments as well. And just to make sure that you are aligning what is taught with what is being tested, and that standardized tests and high stakes tests are usually less reliable than those in the classroom.
And the last group, the special problem of validity.
Yes, it was broken down basically into 2 special problems. One was around goals, and one was a term called face validity. By goals, they meant that the goal seems to be something that you can't grasp at because the goal seems to change, or people have different interpretations of what ultimately the goal of teaching social studies is, whether it's good citizenship versus analyzing documents versus some other component that social studies addresses. And face validity, from how we interpreted it, was that face validity becomes a problem, an issue, because you have so many stakeholders involved in the situation of what, what they see as valid or how they interpret validity. And those stakeholders would include the test takers themselves, we as educators, parents, administrators, and all the people that are involved in the process of creating assessments that, are hopefully truly valid.
All right, thank you to everybody who spoke on behalf of their groups. Now, here comes the special challenge. So you've heard kind of these 5 different chunks, your portion and then 4 other portions. Would anybody like to summarize what they heard and summarize what Grant, Swan, and Lee are telling us in their white paper in 2015? Any brave souls this morning? I'll give you a hint. It's not nearly as complicated as you might think it might be.
I can take a shot at it.
Thank you, David.
So varied assessments, they offer multiple ways for students to basically show what they're learning, but there's multiple problems with these kind of assessments, being that the teacher has the opportunity or method of kind of grading each student differently sometimes. And that's why most teachers go to true and false assessments. And another problem that they talk about is the validity of social studies. So we have to decide what is important for students versus what is not important, and then gear our assessments to what we feel they should learn. That's what I would say.
And can I add, for me, like part of this has to do with being able to like justify grades to not just administrators, but also to parents, and to parents who were taught social studies in a certain way. For us to be doing it differently is hard.
I think that speaks to the face value validity that, who did that part? Andrew was talking about earlier, the stakeholders involved about exactly what should we be assessing. And you'll hear different parts, whether it's family, whether it's legislators, whether it's people on the news. The NAEP scores just came out again, right? And there's always did you know that only 20% of students can name the 3 branches of government type, et cetera? That names and dates part that I think as educators we know isn't a true value, but what is it supposed to be? So what if I pose this question? In reading this paper, what should we be assessing and how should we be assessing it? Can anybody sum that up? I'll do it for you in one word: inconclusive. Unfortunately, it's when they look through all the stuff, right, they lay out the challenges of standardized tests and really talk about how it has to be a classroom-based assessment. But the problem with classroom-based assessments is there's so many variables when it comes to teachers and buildings and schools that we have to try to almost standardize this non-standardized approach around measuring information that we can't quite agree upon what we're actually supposed to be measuring because of that special problem of validity. Is it the names and the dates? Is it those little data points that we need to do it? Is it historical thinking? So I often say that at the end of this, it's inconclusive. There is no simple answer. And the good or bad to it, if we go back to our group of people here, in working with a lot of these individuals and meeting with them and talking with them, they all agree none of them have the answer. That doing a DBQ from Stanford History Education Group is not the end all be all. That's part of a student's education. The primary source stuff that Abby Reisman's done with middle school, that's part of a student's education. Bruce Less talking about History Lab. We're doing his book as one of the book studies. He says it's just part of it. You can't History Lab a kid to death. You can't DBQ a kid to death. You can't weighted multiple choice them to death. It is all part of a bigger piece, but no one's quite sure what the entire menu looks like. So I want to give you that fronting around the idea that there isn't a simple answer. This session today will not be, well, now if you just do X, you have done what you're supposed to do. Okay, Catherine, good. Karen, why does everything have to be formally assessed? We're going to talk about today how many different things, when I talk about some or formative assessments, there's going to be a lot of examples where I say, I really don't care what the student is saying. I want to know what they're thinking. We're going to see that at the beginning, that I'm okay with as many wrong answers as a student can give, as long as it gives me better insight into what they're thinking and how they're thinking, what they're doing with that. So I'm going to do just very quickly, I want to introduce you to the question formulation technique. If it's something you're not familiar with, I do have embedded in here, I believe, a link to a webinar. We did do a session with the Right Question Institute where they demonstrated how to do a question formulation technique. And then in a different session around primary sources, Shane Gower incorporates the question formulation technique. So we're just going to do it very, very quickly so you get a taste. If it's something that you want to know more about, I can direct you to other resources. But our key focus for right now is the word assessments. So on a computer, on a pen and paper, or just in your head, I'm going to give you just 2 minutes, and I want you to come up with as many questions as you can related to assessments. Don't judge yourself, don't worry, don't stop, don't cause for typos. Just go ahead and for 2 minutes, write down anything that comes into your head. So I'm going to go ahead and give you 2 minutes starting now. Okay, that's 2 minutes for everybody. What I want you to do now, and again, we're going to go very quickly. Normally, if you're going to do this with students, especially if you've had them do it before and you get better at this, it's the idea, this is like a 4, 5, 6 minute piece. It's to really get deep into questions. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to go backtrack, write down, number all of them. You're going to want to make sure that anything you've written down is actually a question. So sometimes as you're processing through, you reread it and you say, oops, that's actually not a question. That's just a statement. And so you could do a little bit of those editing prompts. But what we're really trying to focus on is getting those on the paper. And then we look for open-ended and close-ended questions. And this would be something you'd want to talk with your students if you're going to do the question formulation technique. What are the pros and cons of an open-ended, close-ended? What are they? Et cetera, et cetera. And so take a moment to look at your questions and put an O by them if it's an open-ended question, and a C by them if they're a close-ended question. And I always say that I'm very particular about my open-ended questions, is that an open-ended question really has no direction in what the right answer may or may not be. I know a lot of times people say close-ended question, well, it's a yes or no, or it's got one answer, or it's got, you know, this, that. And I say, like, it doesn't matter how complicated or long the answer might be. If your question to students is, you know, what were the major factors that led to the Civil War? There are some kind of answers you'd want to look for, right? You're not willing to accept basically anything. You're going to want to talk about some sectionalism, some states' rights, slavery, economics, and you can write a 1,000-page book on what led up to the Civil War. And in my mind, that's still a closed-ended question because you're wanting to get students to those kind of general ideas. I look at open-ended questions more along the lines of one student could answer yes, one student could answer no, and you could be okay with either side, depending on like if they brought the right support to it. So thinking about the Civil War, saying something like, can you truly ever win a war? Has the Civil War come to an end yet? That type of stuff. To me, that's an open-ended question that we then support with close-ended type questions, making sure they understand sectionalism, states' rights, slavery issues, that type of stuff, to fully answer that question. But if a student wanted to say yes or a student wanted to say no, you want to do that. So take a moment now, look at one of your open-ended questions and rewrite it as a close-ended question. And look at one of your close-ended questions and try to rewrite it as an open-ended question. And what I'm wanting you to do here is think about, like, what were you trying to get at, right? It was just a free form. It was a brainstorming process. You went through, you went ahead and just wrote stuff down. And it might not have come out exactly the way you wanted it to come out. So as you're thinking about what was going through your mind at that time, what did you come up with? And does it need to be tweaked? You know, you can, again, write a really fancy question, but maybe you just wanted the kids to know what happened at the Battle of Fort Sumner. Maybe that's all it was, right? So then it's just really just a close-ended question. Or maybe you gave a piece and you're like, oh no, but I really wanted this bigger component to it. And so when you go through this process, it gives you the opportunity to kind of reflect on some of the thoughts that were going through your head. And as we're finishing that up, I want you to also reflect on, I asked you to number your questions, and then we did the open and closed. Does anybody see on their paper or on their computer or in their mind even, a place, did you start with open and eventually move to closed? Did you start with closed and then eventually move to open? How did that process look like kind of on your sheet? And is anybody willing to share?
I did every other one.
Did you? Okay. And Karen, you had the juices flowing in the chat box. Before I even asked you what questions you had about assessment, you already had a question. Why does everything have to be formally assessed?
That's definitely open.
Did anybody see a trend? Karen went every other. What we see a lot of time with this, if you look at, the book is called Make One Change, is the research by Rothstein and Santana related to what they've done with this. And what you oftentimes see is students especially, but people in general, will start with close-ended questions. And then around question like 6, 7, 8, typically, I think it's like 7 to 10, somewhere in there, you start to see a flip more towards open. We start at that very surface level of kind of who, what, when, before we start to process down into why or how. We start very general, and then something takes our curiosity down almost like a rabbit hole. Something we want to know more about, it triggers something. And that's the idea of don't stop, don't think, don't judge. Just let your brain go wherever your brain would want to go. That's how you're going to get deeper into those questions. And that's why you also need to take time and let students really keep thinking. And it's okay, not every question is going to be relevant or on topic, but we have to take those barriers down and let them think about as much as possible. So then you would look over your list. And if I was doing this with teachers or we were doing like curriculum work with this or group, I'd have you pick your top 3 and then share with a partner. What were your top 3? What did you like about them? And then again, we'd reflect like what numbers, was it your first question that you really liked, second, third, fourth? Because it tends to be a little bit further down the road. And it's important to note that and realize that because it takes time to come up with a good question, that we do have to dedicate time to this process. And then so where I would see with this, what I really like about the question formulation technique is they talk about there's only 3 different ways a person can think. You can think divergently, which is a brainstorming. You think about as many different things as possible. You can think convergently, where you start to narrow a process down. And you can think metacognitively about your thinking process. And if you do the question formulation technique, you do divergent thinking, then a metacognitive approach, and then convergent. You think of every possible solution, then you think about what you were thinking about, and then you start to narrow down your list. And that is the way that we think about the world. And my example I always use is, if you're ever with a group of people and you're trying to figure out where you're gonna go out to eat for supper that night, right? Everybody starts by brainstorming every restaurant they know. And then eventually somebody starts to throw out things like, well, I don't want to spend a lot of money. or I don't really like pizza, or I had tacos the other night, right? So then we start to think about what we really want to eat. And then we use that information to start narrowing things back down until somebody says, oh, please, that's what we're going with. So it's that process. And to kind of reflect back on what Karen had said earlier, I look at this as something you could use in your classroom, not as a formal assessment, but if I'm introducing the Civil War and I have kids go through this process and every kid comes to me with their 3 favorite questions, I have a pulse for what the kids want to learn about the Civil War. What are they curious about? How can I take the class in that direction? And having to keep track and understand, like a lot of times when I do this, I would want each kid to have their own individual question. I'm going to ask the question, did the Civil War ever come to an end? But Pamela's going to have the question, what role did horses play in the Civil War? And Nate's going to have the question of what advances in technology were there? And David's going to ask about how did rifling change the Civil War? So now I know where you're interested, and I'm going to try to check in with you on those interests. And in fact, I'm going to want one of my end result kind of product assessment pieces to allow you to explore what you want to explore, because that's how I'll get you interested. Does anybody have any other inspirations for how you could see something like this being used in your classroom? Okay. We'll keep going then. Another book that I like is That's a Good Question by Eric Francis. I know there's a group in Maine. He's been to Maine a couple times since I've moved here. So I know there's stuff like that, that people are recognizing his work. And he talks about good questions teach students to think like historians by engaging them in expressing their thoughts about how ideas, incidents, and issues affect the world. And what I really like about his work is that, this is my reminder, we're going to use the chat box here, so make sure you have the chat box open. He says there are 7 levels of questioning. And so in the chat box, I want you to see if you can think of examples of these levels. And Eric Francis doesn't say like any level is better or worse than another one, which I think is really important, because I think we've got this idea like that multiple choice, true, false is bad. And it's not bad. The issue with just those straight multiple choice, true, false, factual questions is what we do with them or how we use them. If that's the only thing we're going to ask kids and we're going to assess them on, then yes, that's a weakness. But kids do need to have some factual questions. They do need to know when the Battle of Gettysburg is. Before we can take them to higher level thinking, they still need to know when the Battle of Gettysburg is. So in the chat box, if you can think of a quick question, a factual question. What's an example of a factual question? It's basically your who, what, when, where. Very straightforward. There's a correct answer. And the example I gave again was, when was the Battle of Gettysburg? So in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, please share an example of a factual question. When was the Mesopotamia civilization at its peak? How many people died at Pearl Harbor? When did the stock market crash? Who is Robert E. Lee's right-hand man? Who is the current president of Rwanda? Yes, there's a correct answer. We would look at that and say, yes, you understand that. Who invented the cotton gin? All right, so we're going to look at an analytical question. Analytical questions, they're a way to process in a disciplinary, literate way. So here we're thinking about social studies, right? So what was the message Lincoln was trying to get across in the Gettysburg Address? The factual question would be when it was, or what did he say? But now we need to try to think and analyze his speech. What was the message he was trying to get across? I think Karen got cut off partway through. So any examples of analytical questions? And I will tell you, just in case as we move through, I often go through this, people are like, but isn't that more of a this? Isn't that more of a that? And I don't necessarily think that all of them are complete, like cut and dry. In my head, some of them make sense. So again, we're looking for disciplinary literacy. The DL is disciplinary literacy. We're taking a chunk of information and thinking about it in a social studies type way. Andrew says, how did the stock market crash lead to the Great Depression? And see, we're starting to venture off a little bit because we'll look at some of these other ones. And I do that disciplinary literacy way as the note to myself, that it's just kind of that next level. Because what I see some of these like why. So Kate's example here, I'm going to say is more of a reflective question. Explains the why. Her question was, why were the Japanese angry at the United States before Pearl Harbor? So an analytical question, for me, I like to take a specific document or take a specific something and then analyze that in a way. How did the cotton gin affect the economy of the North and the South? So if we were reading about the history of the cotton gin with Karen's example, we would have some other information. So instead of saying, when was it invented? Where was it invented? Who was it invented? We could give students that same kind of passage, that reading, and then say, so, like, what do you think the effects of this were? And they would be reading through that information, not just to give you the who, what, when, but to do analysis of that piece. And before we go then too far, I'm going to come back. So we have a reflective question. Then why was the Battle of Gettysburg a turning point? A reflective question explains the why. And Kate had given us the question, why were the Japanese angry at the United States before Pearl Harbor? We're explaining a why, right? Pearl Harbor happened. There were things that led up to that. Why? Why did we get to that point? Kate's going back to an analytical. How did D-Day affect the outcome of World War II? And so I have ones here. How did the stock market crash lead to the Great Depression? And how did D-Day affect the outcome of World War II? And again, a lot of these can get blurry. The two of these I kind of like to put more under, and it's not a true, I think you can be good with whatever. I think of those as like the hypotheticals. How did, maybe that's not hypothetical, maybe that is more the analytical. Probably more the analytical. I think you guys are right. Yes, cases, yes. The hypotheticals are my favorites. Possibilities and potentials. What if General Lee had stayed in the Union Army? And I think that's because the stock market crash, like the D-Day, I was thinking about like, well, what if, right? Like, what if D-Day hadn't worked? And I think I jumped to that conclusion right away of changing the question. So I think if you're saying D-Day happened here, this date, this time, this, what role did that play in the war? I think it's that analytical. Why was it such an important part of the war is a reflective question. What if D-Day had failed is a hypothetical. And again, hypotheticals are always, I think they're always my favorite. Well, what if this happened? What if that didn't happen? There's an argumentative question. You're defending a side. So I'm going to take Andrew's question. He says, why was Herbert Hoover targeted as a person to blame for the Great Depression? What about this? Should Herbert Hoover have been blamed? Was Herbert Hoover to blame for the Great Depression? Kate says, how do you assess a hypothetical? Kate, with a lot of these things, for me, it's not always the answer. It's the how they're building their argument. So if I'm going to lay out to students and say, what if D-Day had failed? If we're going to do it like in an essay format, I need them to give me like 3 reference points, 5-paragraph essay format, correct? Like, I just want them building the argument. So if they say, well, if it had failed, the United States would have lost the war, the Allies would have lost the war, and somebody else says, no, it didn't matter, it would have set back, we still would have won the war. And if they can each pull out data or information or research or citations to build that argument, I'm good with whatever they come up with. That's how I'm going to assess them along the way. The last 2 questions, these are the ones that are really hard to grade. Effective, do you believe another civil war is possible in the United States? Okay, now they're gonna have to start to do, that's their own personal. And then the last one, I don't know if it is gradable. What do you want to learn about the Civil War? It's personal curiosity, right? I can't say, Pamela, no, that's not what you're curious about. But it's still an important question to ask kids, their own personal piece of it. And so Eric Francis, if you go through the book, right, it's the idea that all these questions are valid, all these questions should be included. We just need to know why. A factual question is not bad because it's factual. A factual question can be bad if we're using that as the end-all, be-all. If we don't understand why we're using that question. So if I come back here and if I use Kate's question, and again, I'm doing this kind of off the top of my head, so give me some grace, please. If our factual question, and we're talking about D-Day, when was D-Day? Who was the general in charge? Where were the landings? Was this a successful piece even given the loss of life, right? So I'm kind of moving into the analytical piece. Why was this such a turning point in the war? Reflective. What if D-Day had failed? Would the United States, would the Allies have lost the war? Was D-Day the most important day in World War II? Do you think you would have been brave enough to jump over the side on Normandy Beach? What do you want to know about D-Day? Right? We were all D-Day, but it was that span of what are the different ways we can get students to engage in that topic? And again, to kind of go back to Karen's question, I more want, like if I were to have kids write out these questions, I just want to know what their questions are, as opposed to always having just that right answer, that real formative, formal check in there. Just tell me what you're curious. So what some of these can look like in regards to inquiry, these are my lightning round, these are going to go super fast. Some of you may have seen these before I presented on this a little bit, is that take Jeopardy, give kids a topic, and have them answer it in a question. For me, that's a way, if they understand the Emancipation Proclamation, they can frame a coherent question around it. Abraham Lincoln used this to free the slaves. And then I say, well, you can take that and say, well, did it? Do you have the correct interpretation? This document was signed or went into effect January 1st, 1863, right? There's different levels. But have them write a question instead of just giving you an answer. If you've used Likert scales, which I love to use or love to use in the classroom, is I would put one end of my room as strongly disagree, the other end as strongly agree, and then I would ask kids to line up because I love to debate. And then what kids would do is they'd hang around in the middle, right? A handful of kids would go to one end, the other handful of kids would go to the other end because they were super excited, right? They wanted to, but a lot of the kids don't have a vested interest in a lot of the stuff. And so what I started to do was, that's fine. The 5 of you are going to argue yes. The 5 of you are going to argue no. And the 15 or 20 of you in the middle, you're the jury. And while the other people were preparing for the debate, why the answer is yes, why the answer is no, the jury had to write questions. And so the debate was not just a back and forth. The debate was yeses over here, no's over here. And I'd say, okay, Beth, you're in the jury, ask your question. And then both sides would get to respond to the question. And then Beth had to go side with the side that she thought answered the question. Answer the question better. And so I'm just listening to what the two sides have for information, but I'm listening to Beth's question. Was it a legitimate question? And then if Beth went over and sat on this side, Beth, why'd you like that one better? Tell me about your rationale, right? Because I'm hearing the same responses. I'll tell you what eventually happens. Kids stop migrating to the middle because then they're on the spot in the middle. They have to ask a question. So then they're willing to, right? They think the safety's in a number. And then eventually, so you move in and out, right? They're always, is this going to be a we the jury? Am I going to have to be the jury? And just, where do you feel? Just pick a spot, right? They're trying to get ahead of the game. And thank you, Kate, for the chat. As I'm finishing up a lesson or a unit, like a bigger, like 3-4 week thing, what you can do is ask the kids, we have time for one more question. Okay, tomorrow's the last day about the Civil War. What have we not talked about yet that you want to learn about? They write their question on a sticky note and they put it up on the board. And there isn't a right answer. Again, back to Karen's thing. To me, this isn't like a formal check. There isn't a right or wrong, but I want to know where kids are at. What are they still interested in? And I think this is a check for us as well. If a bunch of kids are on the same topic, they want to know more about X, and you see that every year, right? Like, change your lessons. Kids want to know more about this topic. Let's make sure we include that in. What can we chop out? Because kids have an interest in this. And then if we say we're going to spend tomorrow talking about the best question, I'll say, you know, Kate, why is your question the best? Leslie, do you agree? Is Kate's question the best? Leslie's going to like her question probably better, right? Some kids won't. But now I want you here. Why do you want to know more about that? What are you thinking? What's behind that sticky note? And I have the entire class. I know what they want to know more about. If you use a learning target in your class, turn it into a learning question. Today, kids, we're going to get better at sourcing a document. Every kid should be able to write, far left is right. Huh. Correct, Karen. Yes. If your target for the day is today we're going to practice sourcing a document, or students will be able to source a document, how is that a question? Or what could a kid write as a question? What do I need to know to source a document? How do I properly source a document? What are the essential properties of a proper, right? And then I would just keep checking in on them as we go through the day. Annalee, have you been able to answer your question yet? Karen, where are you at with your question? Right? They have ownership of something. It's not just something you've put on the board. They've turned it into something that they can own, and it's meaningful to them. They can check in on. I've had at least one teacher that I know of said they went, at least they told me, I don't know if it's true or not, they went and built one of these permanently on their wall. The high, low, and difficulty and interest level. And you have kids write on sticky notes or however you want, wherever it's at, maybe it's little push pins on a board. You have them ask a question about the topic, and then they have to graph it. Is it interesting? Is it difficult? And again, part of me wants to know the kid's question. Part of me wants to know, where do they put it? Because I think we always have those kids. I was probably one of those kids, right? That was like, did you know that such and such, right? They have these random factoids. And those might be difficult questions, but are they interesting questions? And what would be an interesting question? Pamela, I like your question. Can you make it a little more difficult? How would you rephrase that question to make it more difficult? And I want to say Margaret, but I think yesterday you introduced did you go by Peg yesterday? Is that how you introduced yourself?
Me? I'm Meg.
Meg.
Yes.
I knew you didn't say Margaret. So Meg, maybe Meg puts a question up and I'd say, wow, you know, good question. That's a pretty tough question. Can you make it more interesting, right? Like, you can maneuver kids around, have them revise something. But I'm always curious to see where they put those questions. What do they think is interesting? What do they think is difficult? If you really want to buy in on questions, have kids pay attention. Have somebody keep track of open-ended versus closed-ended questions in your classroom. Have them keep track of factual versus conceptual. If it's meaningful to you, have kids pay attention to it. I will tell you, this is one of those things, before I really understood what an anchor chart was, for my own knowledge and use, I had a depth of knowledge, a DOK wheel, and a Bloom's taxonomy on my wall in my classroom. They were my reminders to myself. And one of my classes actually started calling other students out on it. And I realized that I was standing over there enough, looking at it enough, referencing it enough that students picked up on it. And again, these were high school juniors and seniors, I don't remember what class, but I actually completely unprompted had one kid say, "Come on, Nate, that's a DOK1. You can do better than that." And I was like, what just happened? But it was something that I referenced and made note of, so they picked up on it. If you want kids to do levels of DOK, talk about it. Have them track it. If you want them looking at Bloom's taxonomy, and if you don't agree with it, or you don't have to. But these are all different things. If you want less factual questions in your class, then tally them up each day. If you want more open-ended questions, have them tally them up. Have the students pay attention. Have them keep track. They don't have to answer every question, but they can tally, were you interested? I only answered 2 questions today, but there was only 6 questions I actually found interesting. I thought 22 of them were boring. Right? It's not right or wrong, but if they're having to listen then, they're having to pay attention to those questions. Instead of doing a research paper, research is important, so I'm not saying get rid of all the research papers, but you might not always have time for more 10-page research papers. Have them do the research and then say, assign everybody a group. Our topic was what is it, the corridor, what's the energy corridor? The CMP corridor. We're gonna research that. And then I'm gonna say, okay, Pamela, you need to talk for 30 seconds with the mayor of a local town. And Meg, you're gonna have to do a 30-second talk with the governor. And Nate, you're gonna have to talk with a lobbyist from CMP. And Karen, you're gonna, so everybody can talk about the same topic, but we're not gonna hear the same thing over and over again. And you're gonna pretty quickly have an understanding of if they researched it or not, right? You don't need the full 10-page paper. You can vary things up. Do those interviews. Or you can say, you know, Andrew, what 5 questions should a resident of this town ask them? David, if you're gonna have to vote in the Maine State Legislature on this, what 5 questions do you need answered? And if their questions aren't very good, you know that they didn't develop enough background in it. Right? There's different ways to check those pieces. And you can have them present the same way. You can present as that person. Give me the background on this, on CMP as this person. We're going to talk about windmills as this person. We're going to talk about the legislative process in Maine as this person. We're going to ask questions as this person. And I'm just listening to the questions. This I'm going to do super quickly because I did a whole session on this. Actually, I'm glad Leslie's here. This was per Leslie's request. I think this was her session. You can just have kids. Now we're getting into the thinking process. I'm going to pose them questions, and I just want to hear what they think, because what I'm doing is I'm listening for their historical thinking skills. How are they thinking about this information? And I do have the full webinar linked in here, and all this stuff will be posted later, but you can already find this on my professional learning page. But we walk through each one of these 28 questions one at a time. Can students source a document? Can they tell you who created it? Can they tell you the year? Where? The title? It's some of that factual piece of information, but what we're starting to build in, it's not their inquiry, it's what are they thinking? And a lot of this is based in John Hattie's work, Visible Learning. I think this comes up at the end, right? These are sentence stems. They're little writing prompts. This is how you get into what's in the kid's head. And it goes deeper, right? We talk about this was all sourcing, but we can get into close reading. What do you see that you think everybody sees? That's how I know what the kid's thinking. What did they see? They saw a whole bunch of stuff. There's something that they thought was obvious. Why did they think that that was obvious? And what do you see that you don't think anybody else sees? What little secret do they think that they found? And I don't have a right answer. I just want to hear what they're thinking about it. Why did they notice the person in the background, and why do they think nobody else did? As you're processing this information and looking at it, what would you want to ask the person who created it? If you're looking at multiple documents, multiple pictures, multiple anything, what do they have in common? Can you group them based on similarities? And I know I'm going fast. You don't have to, if anybody's trying to write all these down, I've got all these for you. Group them on similarities. Can you describe them? If I were to say, here's these three, and here's these three. Give me a word or phrase that sums them up. I'm not looking for a right answer. I'm not looking for a question. I'm looking for a window into what are you thinking about the pieces of the documents, the primary sources in front of you, right? Because oftentimes we want to go to those true false pieces right away to come up with the correct answer, but that's showing like the knowledge piece. I want to know your thinking. Do you see any shared perspectives? Yes, these three over here, these are from men, and these four over here are from women. These four over here are from kings and queens, and these three are from over here. These are from British people. These are from French people. These are from businessmen. Whatever it is, what are they thinking about these documents? What do they see as different? And we can be looking at the same set of documents. We can be sitting in the same room together. That doesn't mean we're going to see those same things. It's my way to see what's in your head. How do you highlight conflicting perspectives? I need you to pick out two of these documents that very clearly conflict. Which two conflict and why? What do you think they're trying to tell you? Right? We heard this with the Abe Lincoln speech. What's the message he's trying to get across? Let's think beyond the words here a little bit. What are they trying to tell you? Is there anything missing that you can attribute to the bias? Are they too slanted in something, right? Everything is good here, says the queen. Well, of course everything's good for the queen. There isn't a single good thing about our country, says the poor, hungry man. Well, yeah, in his situation, there probably isn't. But what are they leaving out, right? Can you put pieces in and help share that understanding? If I give you a handful of documents, can you tell me which one you think is the most reliable? Who are you going to believe? And why? What about that makes it reliable? What are the students looking at? What are they processing? Which ones do they think is least reliable? And why? If I give you a bunch of documents, can you teach something with it? Here's 3, 4, 5, 8 documents, depending on the grade level. Can you guess what our next topic's going to be? Or what would you teach with it? You need to teach a 25-minute lesson with these 6 documents. What are you going to teach? Have them do a little mini lesson. Write a question. We're back to our question piece. Here's your 5 documents. If I were to have you do a document-based question, a DBQ, what would you want the question to be so that you could use these 5 documents? If that was the question, and these were your 5 documents, how useful are they? What's your most useful document? What's second? What's third? What's fourth? What's fifth? Again, I don't have a right answer. I don't care what question you write to some level. I don't care how you rank them. But the question that you write and your ranking helps me understand how you're thinking about these documents. What do you see as the topic? What do you see as the question? Like, oh, you put that one first. Well, tell me more about that, right? Have them get into observing portraits. This is from the Kennedy, not the Cape Kennedy, the Kennedy Center for the Arts. Make sure that they take time to actually look and think about the visual images that they see. I personally always use the front 6. They taught us a little dance routine that goes with this. Facial expression, focal point, gesture, clothing, setting, objects. You should be able to find those in every image that you see. And then they can write, again, we're back into these sentence stems. And I love these conversation starters. And this next page, give these to kids. have a student, have a class, or have a student look at an image, look for these 6 things. What is the facial expression? Where are they looking? Are they doing anything? Is there a gesture? What are they wearing? Where are they at? Are there any objects that are important? And then give them one of these questions. Fill in the blank. When I see George Washington, it makes me think blank. When I see the object, when I see the book, it makes me feel. When I see the clothing, it makes me wonder, were they cold? Again, I don't have a right answer on any of this. And I keep referring back to Karen's thing, as to me, none of these are really formal pieces. I just want to know what's in the student's head. We'll do a little bit more of the formal in the second section, the speaking, listening, reading, writing. But I want to be prompting kids with this so I can keep understanding where they're at. And I've talked about John Hattie a couple times. He talks about the 6 characteristics of an assessment-capable visible learner. And I look at number 5 here is monitoring progress. As students are doing those sentence stems, if a student can't complete that sentence stem, that's a check on their progress. You don't have to answer, right? You don't collect all their stuff and grade them and hand them back. It's a way for a student to understand. If you say, well, I gave you these documents and rank them, and the student's like, I don't know. That's a check for them, right? Okay, everybody should be able to rank these and explain whether it's right or wrong. So in Hattie, in his book, The Characteristics of Assessment-Capable Visible Learners, in this section, he talks about sentence stems. These are ways for students to, how do they feel? I was given this writing prompt, and how did I feel about my ability to answer that? If I don't feel good about my ability to answer that, then I need to go back. That's where I'm at. And I see these in the Stanford. I love this chart. Oh, and before I forget about Hattie, if you're not familiar with using jigsaws, and I hope that you are, what we started at the very beginning, if you look through Hattie's impact, the effect size of different things, the number one strategy that you can do as a teacher, because there's things that have all sorts of different impact levels or effect sizes, the one that you can actually just implement tomorrow in your classroom that has the biggest effect size is the jigsaw. It has the largest effect size in terms of student learning. I'm a big fan. I love jigsaws. So if you're familiar with his work, you may have known that. If you're not familiar with his work, have that little takeaway. The number one thing, according to John Hattie's research, that has an impact on student learning that you can do tomorrow, right? Because bigger things are like home environment and access to technology, and like bigger issues you can't impact in your class, but you can do a jigsaw in class anytime. But back to the Stanford History Education Group, I love this chart because I always say, whatever your skill is, you've got a question prompt for the kids that you can ask, you've got a learning target for the day, and you've got a sentence stem. For me, this would be my exit ticket. Okay, today we're going to talk about whatever document. We're going to look at who wrote it, when was it written, why was it written. So we want to be able to identify our target for today as the author's position on a historical event. And your exit ticket that I want you to hand in before you leave is the author probably believes ... And then I'm just going to check to see where the kids are at. And you could also, like, if you are struggling to answer this question, you may need to go back. There's our little student monitoring progress. When you do that set of multiple choice and then they turn it in, where are they allowed to monitor and check their own progress? Are they allowed to go back and change some items or move some things around? Are you giving a multiple choice can just be used as that check. Where are you at with these things? But students should have opportunities to monitor their own progress. And Hattie talks about, and I like just the sentence stems again, because Stanford has these these prompts laid out right here. We've got about 4 minutes or so before we go into, I'll end this session, and we'll show up at 10:30 with part 2. Is there any questions that anybody has for me at this time? I do have a reference page. These are the different things you will see. And it's the same reference page for both sections. I didn't go through to split out which sections are on which one. But a lot of times when I do my full day sessions, people ask me about the books that I reference. So I've started putting that into there.